The air in Aurelia was not merely air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, a gilded substance thick with the scent of old money, leather, and a faint, almost imperceptible hint of white truffles. It was a place where silence was the most expensive commodity, broken only by the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals and the delicate surgical clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain plates worth more than a month of Elena Vance's rent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling like frozen constellations, casting a soft, forgiving light upon the faces of the men who moved markets and toppled governments between their appetizer and their main course. Through this gilded sanctuary, Elena moved with a practiced invisibility, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her steps were silent on the plush Persian rugs, her movements economical and precise, as she refilled water glasses and cleared plates. To the patrons, she was part of the decor, a functional and forgettable automaton whose only purpose was to facilitate their comfort. They did not see the mind working furiously behind her calm, impassive eyes, a mind that was sharper, quicker, and more lethal than any of them could possibly imagine. Her name was Elena Vance, and the uniform she wore was a cage. It was a disguise she had perfected over 5 long years, a shroud for the woman she was supposed to be. Beneath the starched collar and the polite, vacant smile was the ghost of Columbia Law School's most promising student, a prodigy who could once recite entire sections of the New York State Property Code from memory. As she poured still water into a hand-cut crystal glass, she overheard fragments of a conversation about a hostile takeover. Her mind, an involuntary muscle, instantly began to dissect the strategy, identifying 3 distinct legal vulnerabilities and a potential antitrust violation the men were blithely ignoring. She suppressed the urge to intervene, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. This intellect, once her greatest asset, was now her heaviest burden, a constant reminder of a life stolen from her. She had learned to silence the voice of the advocate, the strategist, the legal scholar, and perform the duties of a servant, all while a silent storm of precedent and statute raged within her. Every night, she served the very architects of the world that had broken her family, a penance she paid in silent, measured steps. The motivation for this self-imposed exile was a memory that never faded, a wound that never truly healed. It was the image of her grandfather, a kind and honest man named Arthur Vance, who had built a small but respectable portfolio of properties in Brooklyn through decades of hard work. He was a man who believed in handshakes and a person's word, and she remembered the day his world crumbled. She remembered the slick, predatory lawyers from a faceless corporation, the mountain of incomprehensible documents, and the look of utter devastation in her grandfather's eyes as he realized he had been swindled out of his life's work. The ensuing stroke had been swift and merciless, leaving him a shadow of the man he was until his death. Now all that remained of his legacy was her grandmother, Grace, living in the same rent-controlled apartment for over 50 years, a final, fragile link to their past. The money Elena earned in this gilded cage, every dollar earned through humility and invisibility, went to Grace's mounting medical bills and the fight to keep her in the only home she had ever known. This was not a job, it was a mission, fueled by a love so fierce it bordered on silent fury. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The story of Elena Vance is one of quiet strength and righteous justice, a testament to the fact that the most powerful fire often burns where no one is looking. Her journey from the shadows into the light is a reminder that a person's worth is not defined by their uniform or their station, but by the courage they hold within their heart. What you are about to witness is the moment a spark of defiance is struck in the oppressive darkness, the beginning of an inferno that will consume an empire built on lies and cruelty. The world of the powerful is about to be shaken to its very foundation by the one person they never even bothered to see, the silent servant who holds the key to their undoing. The delicate equilibrium of the evening shattered the moment Marcus Thorne entered the restaurant. It was not a loud entrance, but the shift in the room's energy was palpable, like a drop in barometric pressure before a violent storm. Other titans of industry, men who commanded immense respect in their own right, straightened their ties and offered subtle, deferential nods in his direction. Thorne, the billionaire CEO of Thorne Global Properties, moved as if he owned not just the building, but the very air within it. He was dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to his frame, a dark armor of wealth and power. He didn't acknowledge the host who rushed to greet him. He simply waved a dismissive hand, his eyes scanning the room not for a person, but for his reserved throne. To Elena, he was the living embodiment of the soulless, predatory capitalism that had devoured her family. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs, a primal rhythm of dread and a deep, instinctual hatred for a man whose name she did not yet know, but whose kind she knew all too well. Seated at the best table with a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline, Thorne held court with a much younger, visibly nervous investor. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he pontificated, his voice a low, confident rumble that sliced through the restaurant's hushed ambiance. He spoke of acquisitions and leveraged buyouts, of maximizing shareholder value and trimming the fat. He treated the lives and businesses he consumed as mere figures on a balance sheet, obstacles to be bulldozed on the path to greater profit. Elena moved towards their table, the heavy silver water pitcher feeling like a lead weight in her hand. She was forced to listen as he boasted about his ruthless efficiency, his philosophy of taking what he wanted simply because he could. Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown at the memory of her grandfather, a man who had built with his hands while men like Thorne destroyed with their pens and their armies of lawyers. A cold, familiar sickness coiled in the pit of her stomach as she performed her duties, her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. Then, the world tilted on its axis. Thorne, in an effort to impress his young associate, began to boast about his latest project, the acquisition of an old, rent-controlled apartment building in Brooklyn. He described it with undisguised contempt, calling it a relic occupied by dead weight that was depressing the property value. He spoke of his plans to gut the building, to convert it into luxury condos for the city's new elite. As Elena leaned in to refill his glass, her movements fluid and automatic, Thorne mentioned the cross streets, a casual detail in his grand narrative of conquest. For Elena, the names of those streets struck her like a physical blow. Her blood ran cold, the sounds of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the soft music, the low hum of conversation, dissolved into a deafening roar in her ears. Her hand, the one holding the heavy silver pitcher, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. It was Grace's building. It was the last piece of her family, the last sanctuary, and this man, this monster, was casually plotting its annihilation over a plate of seared scallops. Thorne, oblivious to the cataclysm he had just triggered, continued his performance. He launched into a detailed explanation of the legal strategy he was employing to bypass tenant protections, a strategy designed to expedite the evictions. He used highly technical legal jargon, mispronouncing a key term and citing a statute that had been amended 2 years prior, a small but critical error that screamed of hubris, of a man so insulated by his power he no longer bothered with the details his lawyers were paid to handle. He was so engrossed in his own brilliance, in the sound of his own voice, that he only noticed Elena when she paused, her body frozen beside his table. He looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive, seeing not a person but an inconvenience. A cruel, condescending smirk spread across his face. He gestured vaguely with his fork towards her. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, loud enough for his guests and the nearby tables to hear. "It's all way, way above your pay grade." The insult landed, but not in the way Thorne intended. It was not a spark. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 years. In that single humiliating moment, the years of suppressed rage, the suffocating grief for her grandfather, and the gnawing fear for her grandmother's future converged. The dismissive wave of his hand, The casual cruelty in his voice, the arrogant assumption of her ignorance, it all coalesced into a single point of absolute, chilling clarity. The image of her grandfather, frail and defeated in a hospital bed, flashed behind her eyes, followed by the terrified look on her grandmother's face when the first notice had arrived. The fawning, invisible waitress persona she had so carefully constructed over the years did not just crack, it disintegrated into dust. The fury in her veins did not burn hot. It turned to ice, solidifying her resolve. Her spine straightened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Her breath, which had hitched in her throat, became slow, deep, and controlled. Her hand, once trembling, was now perfectly steady on the silver pitcher. The ghost of Columbia law's finest was stirring from her long slumber, and she was ready to speak. The silence that followed his words was not empty. It was a dense, heavy substance that seemed to absorb all the ambient sound in the restaurant, leaving only the frantic, thudding drumbeat of Elena's own heart. His insult, meant to swat her away like an insignificant fly, had instead acted like a tuning fork, striking a perfect, resonant frequency deep within her soul that shattered 5 years of carefully constructed silence. She did not flinch or recoil. Instead, an almost preternatural calm descended upon her. The trembling in her hand ceased completely. With a deliberation that felt both ancient and immediate, she placed the heavy silver water pitcher on the nearby service stand. The soft metallic thud was the only sound in the frozen tableau, a period placed at the end of a long, painful chapter of her life. The waitress, the ghost in the uniform, vanished. In her place stood Elena Vance, Juris Doctor candidate, top of her class, and the granddaughter of Arthur Vance. The rage was still there, a white-hot core deep inside her, but it was no longer a chaotic fire. It had been forged and cooled by the insult into something sharp, focused, and unbreakable. Her spine, which had been accustomed to a slight, deferential stoop, straightened to its full height, an act of defiance so subtle yet so powerful that it seemed to subtly alter the geometry of the room. Her voice, when it finally came, was nothing like the hushed, professional tone she had used for half a decade. It was not loud, but it possessed a clarity and a cutting edge that sliced through the thick, opulent air of Aurelia with surgical precision. It was a voice that had been honed in mock trial competitions and sharpened in debates with the finest legal minds of her generation, a voice she thought she had buried forever. It carried no trace of anger or emotion, only the cold, hard weight of irrefutable fact. She did not look at his guest or the other patrons, whose forks had frozen midway to their mouths. Her eyes, clear and unblinking, were locked directly onto Marcus Thorne's. The cruel smirk was still plastered on his face, an arrogant mask that had not yet registered the seismic shift that had just occurred. He was expecting a stammered apology, a frightened retreat. He was utterly unprepared for the intellectual annihilation that was about to befall him. She let the silence hang for another heartbeat, allowing his humiliation to marinate in the thick, expectant air before she began to methodically dismantle his world, one perfectly articulated word at a time. The first sentence was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the calm authority of a tenured professor correcting a particularly dull-witted student. She began by addressing his flawed legal strategy, not with an accusation, but with a clinical correction. She spoke of the New York State Rent Stabilization Law of 1969, explaining with unnerving detail the specific protections it afforded to tenants in buildings constructed before 1974, like the one her grandmother lived in. Her mind, a flawless and perfectly indexed archive, retrieved the exact statutory language, the subclauses and amendments he had so arrogantly overlooked. She described how his plan to use a loophole related to major capital improvements was fundamentally flawed, pointing out that the required tenant notifications had to follow a protocol established by a 2019 revision to the Housing Code, a revision his legal team had clearly missed or ignored. As she spoke, the condescending amusement on Marcus Thorne's face began to slowly curdle, melting away to reveal a foundation of stunned disbelief. The young investor seated across from him had gone pale, his eyes darting between Elena and his powerful host, a dawning horror spreading across his features as he began to comprehend the catastrophic legal exposure she was effortlessly outlining. Elena felt a grim satisfaction, a cold and righteous pleasure in peeling back the layers of his power to expose the ignorant, arrogant core beneath. Then came the final, devastating blow. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her initial corrections settle into the suffocating silence. Her gaze never wavered from Thorne's, holding him pinned like a specimen under a microscope. Then she delivered the coup de grace, the piece of information that transformed his flawed strategy from a potential problem into a guaranteed legal disaster. She cited, from memory, the landmark appellate court case, Hernandez versus the estate of Cohen from 1987. She didn't just name the case, she articulated its core holding with breathtaking precision, explaining how the court had ruled that any attempt to systematically harass tenants into vacating their rent-controlled apartments constituted a pattern of illegal eviction, opening the landlord not just to individual lawsuits, but to a massive, multi-million-dollar class-action lawsuit for punitive damages. She explained exactly how his publicly stated plan, the one he had just been boasting about, fit the legal definition of tenant harassment to the letter. She laid out the legal precedent with the dispassionate air of a chess master explaining a checkmate that had been inevitable for the last 10 moves, a checkmate he had been too arrogant and too blind to see coming. The aftermath was a vacuum of sound and motion. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its collective breath. The young investor looked as if he was about to be physically ill, the implications of what he had just heard crashing down upon him. He was a witness. He had heard Thorne boast about a strategy that was not just flawed, but patently illegal. His association with this deal had just become toxic. But all of Elena's focus was on Thorne. The billionaire's face had become a grotesque mask of fury. The initial shock had given way to a deep, crimson flush that crept up from his starched collar, engulfing his neck and face. His eyes, once cold and dismissive, now burned with a humiliated rage so profound it was almost pathetic. He was a king who had been publicly stripped naked by a servant, a god whose mortality had been laid bare for all his disciples to see. He opened his mouth to speak, to retort, to crush her with the sheer force of his authority, but no words came out. He could only make a strangled, guttural sound, the noise of a predator who had just realized it had walked into a perfectly laid trap. The paralysis lasted only a moment before it shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated fury. Thorne's reaction was not that of a businessman who had been outmaneuvered. It was the primal roar of a narcissist whose carefully constructed reality had been violated. He shoved his heavy oak chair back with such violence that it screeched across the polished marble floor and toppled over with a deafening crash. The sound broke the spell that had fallen over the dining room, causing several patrons to gasp. He slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the fine china and silverware. His face was contorted, the veins in his temple throbbing visibly. He could not attack her on the battlefield of intellect. She had already conquered that ground completely. So he retreated to the only weapon he had left, raw, brute power. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her, his voice finally returning in a low, venomous snarl that was meant for her alone, but was heard by everyone in the vicinity. He did not try to refute her legal analysis. He didn't even address it. He simply attacked her, the messenger, with all the venom he could muster. He did not raise his voice to a yell. It was something far more menacing. It was a controlled, seething hiss, a promise of utter destruction. He ignored his guest completely, his entire universe having collapsed to the space between him and the woman in the black uniform who had dared to challenge him. He turned his burning gaze away from her and scanned the room until he found the restaurant's manager, a man named Julian, who was already rushing towards the table with a look of pure panic on his face. Thorne didn't wait for him to arrive. He met him halfway, grabbing the smaller man by the upper arm in a grip that was painfully tight. He leaned in close, his voice a low, threatening growl. He didn't care who heard. In fact, he wanted them to hear. He wanted to make an example of her. He told Julian, in no uncertain terms, that if Elena was not fired, immediately and publicly, he would not only never set foot in Aurelia again, but he would make it his personal mission to destroy the restaurant's reputation. He would call every one of his powerful friends, every CEO, every hedge fund manager, and ensure they blacklisted the establishment forever. It was a display of raw, thuggish power, a corporate execution order delivered over the remains of a lobster bisque. The manager, Julian, was a man trapped in an impossible position. His face, normally a placid mask of professional hospitality, was now a canvas of sheer terror. He looked from the incandescent rage on Thorne's face to the unnerving calm on Elena's. He was a decent man, but he was also a man with a mortgage, a family, and a career that was now hanging by a thread. He knew who Marcus Thorne was. He knew the threat was not an idle one. He could see his life's work, the reputation he had spent decades building, about to be incinerated in the fire of one billionaire's wounded pride. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He avoided Elena's eyes, unable to meet her steady gaze. He turned to her, his voice a barely audible stammer, the words of termination catching in his throat. He apologized profusely, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only thing he could do. He told her she had to leave immediately, that she was fired, that he had no choice. It was a pathetic and cowardly act, and in the profound silence of the room, everyone knew it. They were all witnesses to a gross injustice, a public execution of a woman whose only crime was being smarter than the most powerful man in the room. Elena did not protest. She did not beg or argue. She had known, from the moment she decided to speak, that this would be the inevitable consequence. It was the price of truth, the toll demanded by the gods of capital and power. She simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that was more regal than anything Thorne could ever muster. In a final act of quiet defiance and unshakable dignity, she unfastened the crisp white apron from around her waist. She folded it slowly, methodically, into a neat, perfect square, as if performing a sacred ritual. Then, she placed it gently on the now empty service stand, next to the silver water pitcher. It was an act of closure, a final severing of her ties to this place, and the life of invisibility she had led within its gilded walls. She turned, without a single glance back at Marcus Thorne or the wreckage of his ego, and began her long walk out of the restaurant. Every eye in the room followed her, a silent procession of gazes filled with a mixture of shock, pity, and for a few, a spark of profound admiration. She walked with her head held high, her back straight. A queen abdicating a throne she had never wanted. The heavy, polished oak doors of Aurelia swung shut behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding as final as a prison gate. The transition was jarring, a violent expulsion from a world of curated warmth and light into the raw, indifferent chaos of a New York City night. The cold November air hit her like a slap in the face, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection she had just left. The sounds of the city, which had been a muted hum behind the restaurant's thick windows, now rushed in to fill the silence. The blare of a distant siren, the rumble of a passing subway beneath the pavement, the cacophony of 1,000 different lives intersecting on the crowded sidewalk. For a moment she just stood there, a solitary figure in a simple black uniform, clutching her worn coat. And then, the adrenaline that had sustained her, the icy resolve that had fortified her, began to recede, and the full, crushing weight of what she had just done crashed down upon her. The immediate, terrifying reality of her situation pierced through the haze of righteous satisfaction. She was jobless. She had no savings. And she had just publicly declared war on one of the most powerful and vindictive men in the city. A wave of despair, cold and sickening, washed over her. It was a feeling she knew well, a familiar ghost from the days after her grandfather's stroke. She leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, the rough texture grounding her as a tremor ran through her body. What had she done? That single act of defiance, that glorious, satisfying moment of speaking truth to power, may have just signed her grandmother's eviction notice. Thorne would not forget this. He would not let it go. He would come after her And he would come after her family, with the full, merciless force of his immense resources. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She had thrown a stone at a giant, and now the giant was awake, and he was angry. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she wished she could take it all back, that she could rewind time and just pour the water, walk away, and remain invisible. She could have kept her job, kept the meager but steady income that was the only thing standing between her grandmother and the street. The burden of her choice felt immense, a mountain of consequence pressing down on her shoulders. But then, another image rose unbidden in her mind, pushing back against the tide of fear. It was the image of Marcus Thorne's face, not his rage, but the moment of pure, uncomprehending shock when she had cited Hernandez versus the estate of Cohen. It was the look of a man who had never been challenged, a bully who had just met someone who was not afraid of him. And as she replayed that moment, the despair began to recede, replaced by something harder, something colder. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was clarifying. For 5 years, she had been a victim, a passive observer of her family's slow-motion destruction, fighting a desperate, defensive battle just to stay afloat. She had been reacting to the world Thorne had created. But tonight, for the first time, she had acted. She had pushed back. She had drawn first blood. The fight was no longer about survival. It was no longer about just protecting her grandmother. A new, unshakable purpose began to solidify in her heart. It was about justice. It was about dismantling the man who had built an empire on the ruins of her family and countless others like them. A new kind of energy surged through her, a cold, clean fire that burned away the last vestiges of her despair. She was no longer just Elena Vance, the disgraced waitress. She was Elena Vance, the legal strategist, and she had a new client, the memory of her grandfather. She pushed herself off the wall, her posture once again erect and purposeful. Her mind, now fully unshackled from its years of dormancy, began to race, not with fear, but with strategy. Thorne had power, money, and influence. But she had something he didn't. She had the truth. And she had a mind that could wield that truth like a weapon. He had made a critical error tonight. In his arrogance, he had revealed his strategy, his target, and his ignorance, all in one fell swoop. He had shown her his hand. Now, it was her turn to play. She began walking, not aimlessly, but with a newfound direction, her steps quick and sure on the cold pavement. She was no longer running from a fight, she was walking towards a war, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever: hope. The subway ride from the rarefied air of Midtown Manhattan to the gritty, familiar streets of her Brooklyn neighborhood was like traveling between two different worlds. The sterile silence of Aurelia was replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, the murmur of a dozen different languages, the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the real city. She looked at the faces around her, the tired construction worker, the young student with her head buried in a textbook, the elderly woman clutching her grocery bags. These were the people Thorne dismissed as, quote, dead weight, the human beings he saw only as obstacles on a balance sheet. But she saw a community. She saw resilience. She saw the very people her grandfather had provided with safe, affordable homes for decades. This was the world she was fighting for, a world that was far more real and far more valuable than the gilded cage she had just been expelled from. The train screeched to a halt at her stop, and she stepped out into the familiar night air, the scent of home filling her lungs and strengthening her resolve. As she approached her grandmother's building, she saw it not through the lens of a resident, but through the eyes of a legal warrior assessing the battlefield. She saw the chipped paint on the facade, the crack in the front stoop, the slightly flickering light in the entryway. To an outsider like Thorne, it was a sign of decay, a property ripe for gutting. But Elena saw something else. She saw a history. She saw the place where generations of families had started their lives, where children had taken their first steps, where a community had been woven together over 50 years. This building was not just brick and mortar, it was a living repository of memories, a testament to a different kind of value that could never be quantified on a corporate spreadsheet. Thorne's desire to destroy it was not just a business decision, it was an act of desecration. Standing there, on the cold sidewalk, looking up at the warm, lighted window of her grandmother's apartment, Elena made a silent vow. She would not let him erase this. She would not let him win. She would burn his entire empire to the ground before she let him lay a single finger on this last, precious piece of her family's legacy. She walked into her small, cramped apartment, the weight of the night still heavy on her, but her purpose was now as clear and as hard as a diamond. The first phase of the war had been won. She had exposed a vulnerability. But a single battle did not win a war. Thorne would recover. His lawyers would scramble to patch the hole she had blown in their strategy. She needed more. She needed a bigger weapon. She needed to go beyond the current eviction fight and strike at the very foundation of his power. Her knowledge of the law was a formidable weapon, but knowledge without evidence was just theory. She needed proof. She needed documentation. She needed something that could transform her accusations from the words of a disgruntled ex-employee into a story that could not be ignored. Her mind raced, sifting through the archives of her memory, searching for a starting point, a thread she could pull that might unravel everything. The path forward was dark and uncertain, filled with risks she couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time, she could see a path. Her mind landed on a name, a figure from her past, from the life she had been forced to abandon, Professor Alistair Albright, her mentor at Columbia Law. He had been her fiercest advocate, a brilliant and notoriously cantankerous professor of corporate ethics who had been devastated when she dropped out. He had seen the spark in her, the once-in-a-generation legal mind, and had pushed her harder than any other student. He was retired now, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and more importantly, he had a deep and abiding hatred for corporate predators like Marcus Thorne. He was the one person who would believe her without question. He was the one person who might know how to navigate the treacherous waters she was about to enter. He wouldn't fight the battle for her, but he might give her a map and a compass. Finding him would be her first move. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp for an ally in a fight she could not possibly win alone. She crossed the small room to the old, dusty bookshelf where she kept her college textbooks, her fingers tracing the faded spines of books she hadn't opened in years. The hunt had officially begun. What was the most satisfying moment of Marcus Thorne's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. The world had reduced her to a function, an invisible pair of hands meant to serve and be silent. But tonight, she had found her voice again, and with it, a power she had long forgotten she possessed. The fear of what was to come was real and immense, a cold shadow that lingered at the edge of her thoughts. But stronger than the fear was a new, unyielding conviction. She was the living legacy of Arthur Vance, a man who had been broken by the system. But she was not her grandfather. She understood the system. She knew its language, its rules, and its hidden weaknesses. Marcus Thorne had started this war 2 decades ago, when he had swindled an honest man and destroyed a family. He just didn't know it. Tonight he had inadvertently come for the last surviving piece of that family's legacy. And in doing so, he had awakened the one person on earth who had the motive, the means, and the brilliance to make him pay for every single one of his sins. The waitress was gone, and in her place was a warrior, armed with nothing but the law and a righteous fury that could bring down empires. Her journey was just beginning, a perilous path into the heart of a corrupt and powerful empire. She was David, and he was Goliath, a titan of industry with an army of lawyers and endless resources at his command. But David had a slingshot and a single, perfectly chosen stone. Elena's mind was her slingshot, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that somewhere in the labyrinth of Thorne's corrupt dealings, there was a stone with his name on it. Her Her task now was to find it. The initial shock of her firing had transformed into a cold, methodical determination. She would not sleep tonight. She would not rest. She would begin the painstaking work of building her case, of piecing together the puzzle of Thorne's past, of searching for the original sin that had launched his predatory career. She had no idea that the key she was looking for, the irrefutable proof of his crimes, was much closer than she could ever imagine, tucked away in a dusty box of her grandfather's old records, waiting for the light of day. The battle for her grandmother's home had just escalated into a war for her family's soul. The city lights glittered outside her window, a sea of indifferent diamonds. In one of those penthouses, Marcus Thorne was likely fuming, plotting his revenge, using his immense power to ensure she would never work in this city again. He thought he was putting out a small fire, punishing an insolent servant. He had no concept of the inferno she was about to unleash. He had made the most fatal mistake of the arrogant. He had underestimated his enemy. He had looked at Elena Vance and seen a waitress. He had failed to see the brilliant legal mind, the photographic memory, and the unbreakable will of a woman with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of injustice to avenge. He had dismissed her as being far below his pay grade, but she was about to present him with a bill so catastrophic it would bankrupt his entire existence. The confrontation at Aurelia was not the end of a job, it was the beginning of his end, and Elena Vance would be the sole architect of his ruin. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and the checkmate was coming. The first night of her unemployment was a sleepless eternity, a long, dark corridor of doubt and recrimination. Elena sat in the worn armchair in her small living room, the city's ambient glow painting pale, shifting patterns on the walls. The silence of the apartment was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thorne's face, contorted in that mask of humiliated fury. The satisfaction of that moment was a fleeting warmth, now extinguished by the cold, creeping dread of its consequences. She had won a single, spectacular battle, but in doing so had exposed her queen, her grandmother, to the full wrath of the enemy king. The eviction notice, once a vague threat, now felt like an inevitability, a guillotine blade hanging by the thinnest of threads. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, a physical pressure in her chest that made each breath a conscious, labored effort. She had acted on instinct, on a lifetime of suppressed grief and anger, but now, in the sober light of the moon, she had to face the brutal calculus of her actions. She was alone, penniless, and had just antagonized a man who could erase her from existence with a single phone call. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple, a shift occurred within her. The despair, having exhausted itself, began to give way to a familiar, stubborn resilience. This was not the first time she had faced an impossible situation. She had navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the healthcare system for her grandfather, fought tooth and nail with insurance companies, and learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed. She was a survivor. The fight was not over, it had merely changed. She could no longer afford the luxury of fear. She needed a weapon, a shield, something more than the righteous anger that had fueled her outburst at Aurelia. Her mind, the legal engine she had kept dormant for so long, slowly rumbled back to life. It began to sift through possibilities, to search for leverage, for a crack in Thorne's armor, however small. Her gaze drifted around the small apartment, a space filled with the ghosts and memories of a life that had been stolen. It was a museum of her family's history, and it was here, amongst the relics of the past, that she realized her search must begin. Her grandfather had been a meticulous man, a record-keeper from a generation that believed in the sanctity of the written word. Deep in the back of a cramped hall closet, behind a stack of old winter coats that still carried the faint, familiar scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco, was a large, wooden steamer trunk. It was a relic from another era, bound in brass and covered in a thick layer of dust that felt like a shroud. She hadn't opened it in years, Not since the painful days after his death, when she and her grandmother had sorted through his most personal effects. It was a time capsule of his life, a repository of a past too painful to revisit. But now, it was not just a chest of memories, it was a potential arsenal. With a grunt of effort, she dragged the heavy trunk into the middle of the living room. The hinges groaned in protest as she lifted the heavy lid, releasing a musty, earthy smell of old paper, leather, and time itself. Inside, neatly organized in stacks tied with twine, were the records of her grandfather's entire professional life. Ledgers filled with his elegant, looping cursive, folders of property deeds, and thick binders of tax returns dating back to the 1960s. It was the complete, documented history of the small empire he had built with his own two hands, an empire that Marcus Thorne had crushed into dust. For hours she sat on the floor, surrounded by a sea of paper, a forensic accountant of her own family's ruin. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays cutting through the dusty air of the apartment, but she didn't notice. She was lost in the labyrinth of the past, her fingers stained with the ink of forgotten transactions. Each document was a small, painful reminder of what they had lost. She saw the original deed to this very building, purchased in 1972 for a sum that now seemed laughably small. She found receipts for a new boiler he had installed, notes about tenants who had fallen on hard times and whom he had allowed to pay rent late, 100 small testaments to his character, his fairness, his humanity. It was a portrait of a businessman from a bygone era, a man who saw his properties not just as assets but as homes, and his tenants as people. With each page she turned, the cold fury inside her solidified a little more. This was the man Thorne had dismissed, the legacy he had desecrated. The search felt hopeless, a desperate archaeology for a weapon that probably didn't exist. She was looking for a legal error, a procedural flaw, but all she found was the quiet, dignified history of a good man. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the window. Her back ached, her eyes burned from staring at the faded print, and a dull headache began to throb in her temples. Frustration began to set in, a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. What was she even looking for? Thorne's lawyers would have been meticulous, covering their tracks with layers of corporate obfuscation and legal jargon designed to be impenetrable. Her grandfather, a man who trusted handshakes, would have been no match for their predatory sophistication. She was about to give up, to concede that the past was just that. The past, buried and unchangeable. She reached for the last stack of folders at the bottom of the trunk, her movements sluggish with fatigue and disappointment. These files were different, newer, their manila folders less yellowed than the others. One was labeled with a name that made the air catch in her throat, the letters typed in a cold, impersonal font that stood in stark contrast to her grandfather's warm script. The label read, simply, Thorne Acquisition. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The contents were thin, just a few dozen pages. On top was a single, glossy 8x10 photograph, slightly faded at the edges. The image that stared back at her sent a jolt of ice through her veins. It was a picture of two men shaking hands, beaming for the camera. One was her grandfather, looking proud and optimistic, his eyes filled with a hope that now seemed tragic. The other man was younger, his face leaner, his hair darker, but the arrogant, predatory smirk was already there, a chilling premonition of the man he would become. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, a young Marcus Thorne. The monster from the restaurant was not just some random force of corporate greed that had targeted her grandmother by chance. He was the architect of it all. He was the one. The beginning and the end. The man who had boasted about destroying her family's future was the very same man who had destroyed its past. The revelation was not a surprise. Not really. Deep down, a part of her had already known, had felt the sickening symmetry of it all. But seeing the proof, the photographic evidence of this original sin, was like being struck by lightning. Beneath the photograph was a copy of the final sales contract, the document that had transferred her grandfather's life's work into Thorne's possession. She scanned the pages, her eyes, trained by years of legal study, moving rapidly over the dense blocks of text. It looked standard, ironclad, a fortress of legalese. But then she noticed them. In the margins, written in her grandfather's familiar, slightly shaky hand, were a series of small, desperate notes. They were the frantic scribbles of a man realizing, too late, that he had been caught in a trap. Next to a clause detailing the assumption of outstanding debts, he had written a single, damning word: inflated. Beside the signature of a supposed business partner, another note, forged. I never met this man. And near the bottom, a heartbreaking, pleading sentence. They said the final audit would correct these values. Coercion. It was all there. It wasn't just a hostile takeover, it was a premeditated, systematic fraud. Thorne hadn't just outmaneuvered her grandfather, he had cheated, lied, and forged his way to his first great victory. This single piece of paper was not just a contract. It was a confession. She held the document in her hands, the thin, brittle paper feeling as heavy as a stone tablet. This was it. This was the weapon she had been searching for. It was more powerful than anything she could have imagined. This went far beyond a simple eviction dispute. This was evidence of felony fraud, racketeering, the very crimes that had built the foundation of Thorne's entire empire. The statute of limitations for a civil suit had long since passed, she knew that. But for criminal charges, for public exposure, for the complete and utter annihilation of his reputation, this was everything. The cold dread that had haunted her for the past day was burned away by a sudden, brilliant flash of pure, righteous fire. She was no longer just defending her grandmother's apartment. She was avenging her grandfather's life. She finally had the stone for her slingshot, and it was perfectly shaped, perfectly weighted, and aimed directly at the head of the giant. But she knew she couldn't wield this weapon alone. She was a law school dropout, an ex-waitress. To the world, she had no credibility. She needed an ally, someone with the authority and the platform to make this story heard. A name surfaced from the depths of her memory, a beacon in the fog. Professor Alistair Albright. Her former mentor at Columbia, the one who had seen her potential, who had pushed her, challenged her, and been profoundly disappointed when she had walked away from it all. He was a titan in the world of corporate ethics, a man who had dedicated his life to exposing the very kind of corruption she now held in her hands. He was retired, living somewhere upstate, but she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was the only person who would understand, the only person who would believe her. Finding his number took another hour of frantic searching through old emails on her laptop, but when she found it, her heart hammered against her ribs. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. It had been 5 years. What would she say? How could she explain the life she had been living? The silence, the shame. But the image of her grandfather's notes, his desperate final testimony, pushed her forward. She took a deep, steadying breath and made the call, the electronic tones ringing in the silent apartment like a summons to war. The voice that answered was exactly as she remembered it, gruff, impatient, and sharp as a shard of glass. Professor Albright sounded annoyed to be disturbed, and for a moment, Elena's courage wavered. She stammered out her name, and there was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. She could hear the gears turning in his brilliant, cantankerous mind, retrieving her file from the dusty archives of his memory. When he finally spoke again, the impatience was gone, replaced by a tone of genuine, astonished concern. He remembered her. He remembered everything. As she began to tell him the story, the words pouring out of her in a torrent, she could hear the change in his breathing, the occasional sharp intake of breath as he processed the details. She told him about Aurelia, about Thorne's insult, about her firing, and finally, about the documents she had found in the old steamer trunk. She expected skepticism, caution. Instead, what she heard was the sound of a sleeping lion beginning to stir, a low, rumbling growl of pure, academic fury. When she finished, there was another long pause. Then, Albright spoke, his voice no longer just concerned, but energized, alive with a purpose she hadn't heard in years. He didn't question a single word. He told her she had done the right thing, that her instincts had been flawless. He explained the legal ramifications of the documents she held, confirming her own analysis but adding layers of strategic depth she hadn't considered. He told her that while a direct criminal prosecution would be difficult after so many years, the court of public opinion was another matter entirely. He knew a man, he said, a journalist. Not just any journalist, but a young, hungry, fearless investigative reporter named Ben Carter, who had made a name for himself by taking down a corrupt city councilman a year prior. Carter, he explained, had a bulldog's tenacity and a deep-seated hatred for bullies like Thorne. He was the perfect person to break this story. The professor gave her his number, told her to use his name, and made her promise to keep him informed. As she hung up the phone, Elena felt a profound sense of relief. She was no longer an army of one. She had a mentor, a strategist, and a powerful ally in her corner. The meeting with Ben Carter took place the next day in a noisy, greasy spoon diner in a part of Brooklyn that the gentrifiers hadn't yet discovered. It was a world away from the gilded silence of Aurelia. Ben was younger than she expected, with tired eyes that had seen too much and a cynical, world-weary slouch. He listened to her story with a professional detachment, his face giving nothing away as he nursed a cup of black coffee. Elena could feel his skepticism, the protective wall of a journalist who heard a dozen crackpot conspiracy theories before lunch every day. He had likely come here as a favor to an old professor, not expecting much. But then, she slid the manila folder across the sticky Formica tabletop. He opened it, his eyes first landing on the photograph. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest. But when he saw the contract, when his gaze fell upon the handwritten notes in the margins, the change was instantaneous and total. The cynical slouch disappeared. He sat up straight, his entire body language shifting from passive listener to active predator. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the page with a ferocious intensity, a dawning excitement spreading across his face. He wasn't just looking at a document, he was looking at a Pulitzer. For the next 2 hours, the diner booth became their war room. Ben was relentless, firing questions at her with the speed and precision of a machine gun. He wanted every detail, every date, every name. Elena, in turn, laid out the legal framework of the fraud with a clarity and precision that clearly impressed him. She explained how Thorne had used a shell corporation to hide his initial involvement, how he had leveraged the falsified debt to trigger a default clause, how the entire transaction was a house of cards built on a foundation of lies. They were a perfect team, his journalistic instincts and her legal expertise complementing each other flawlessly. He understood how to frame the narrative, how to make it compelling, how to turn a complex financial crime into a simple, powerful story of greed and betrayal. She, in turn, provided him with the irrefutable evidence and the legal context that would make the story legally bulletproof, safe from the inevitable army of libel lawyers Thorne would unleash. As they talked, a plan began to form, a strategy that was both audacious and elegant in its simplicity. They wouldn't just leak the story, they would orchestrate a public execution. Ben's research was swift and thorough. He confirmed that Thorne Global Properties was on the verge of a massive public announcement. In 3 days, Marcus Thorne was scheduled to host a major press conference at the Four Seasons Hotel to unveil his new flagship project, a monstrous skyscraper he was pretentiously naming Thorne Tower. It was to be the crowning achievement of his career, a monument to his own ego. The event would be packed with investors, city officials, and every major news outlet in the country. It was the moment Thorne had been planning for years, the apex of his power and influence. And, as Ben pointed out with a grim smile, It was the perfect stage for his downfall. The plan they devised was simple and devastating. Ben would use his press credentials to get them both into the event. During the question and answer session, Elena would not ask a question. She would walk to the microphone, state her name, and deliver her testimony, not to Thorne, but to the assembled world press. As she spoke, Ben and his technical crew, positioned discreetly in the back, would hijack the ballroom's projection screens, replacing Thorne's glossy architectural renderings with high-resolution scans of the contract, her grandfather's notes, and the faded photograph of the original, fateful handshake. The night before the press conference, Elena stood before the mirror in her small apartment. The woman who stared back at her was someone she barely recognized. The fear and uncertainty were gone, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She was no longer the invisible waitress, the grieving granddaughter, the law school dropout. She was the culmination of her family's history, the instrument of her grandfather's posthumous justice. She thought of Marcus Thorne, preparing for what he believed would be the greatest triumph of his life, completely oblivious to the reckoning that was hurtling towards him. He had built an empire on the ruins of her family, and tomorrow she would stand in the heart of that empire and watch it burn. She was not motivated by vengeance, not anymore. This was something purer. It was about balance. It was about restoring a moral order to a world that Thorne and men like him had thrown into chaos. She laid out the simple, professional black dress she would wear, an echo of her old uniform, but now repurposed as armor. The stage was set. The evidence was secured. The plan was in motion. The checkmate was just one move away. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons was a different kind of rarefied atmosphere than the one at Aurelia. It was not the scent of old money, but of new power, a crisp, sterile smell of public relations and limitless ambition. 1,000 tiny lights glittered in the ceiling, not like frozen constellations, but like the cold, watchful eyes of the global media. On a massive, elevated stage, Marcus Thorne stood at a podium, a king surveying his domain. Behind him, 3 enormous screens displayed a rotating loop of impossibly sleek architectural renderings of his magnum opus, Thorne Tower, a gleaming phallus of glass and steel piercing the New York skyline. He was at the absolute apex of his life, a master of the universe basking in the adoring glow of the spotlight. In the third row, almost lost in the sea of dark suits and expensive cameras, sat Elena Vance. She was a ghost of a different sort now, not invisible due to a uniform, but due to the sheer, audacious improbability of her presence. A deep, preternatural calm had settled over her, a stillness at the eye of the hurricane of her own making. Her heart beat a steady, powerful rhythm, not with fear, but with the solemn, focused energy of a soldier about to complete their mission. This was not a press conference, it was a courtroom, and she was about to present her final, irrefutable evidence. Thorne concluded his speech with a flourish, his voice echoing with a manufactured sincerity that made Elena's stomach turn. The room erupted in a wave of polite, obligatory applause, the sound of hands that were already calculating their return on investment. He smiled, a predator showing its teeth, and opened the floor for questions. The first few were softballs from friendly outlets, questions about market projections and architectural innovations, which he answered with the slick, practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this performance 100 times. He was a god on his mountain, dispensing wisdom to the mortals below. Beside Elena, Ben Carter gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Elena rose from her seat. She did not raise her hand. She did not wait to be called upon. She simply began to walk, her steps measured and deliberate, down the plushly carpeted aisle toward the single, solitary microphone reserved for audience questions. The movement was so out of protocol, so unexpected, that it created a small, localized ripple in the room's energy. Heads turned. A low murmur spread through the crowd. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, but her own gaze was fixed on only one man. She was walking toward the architect of her family's ruin, and with every step she felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy solidifying her spine into steel. She reached the microphone and placed her hands lightly on either side of it, grounding herself. The low hum of the ballroom's ventilation system was the only sound. Thorne, who had been pointing to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, lowered his hand, an expression of mild annoyance clouding his perfectly tanned features. He squinted slightly, trying to place her. A vague glimmer of recognition, perhaps, but he quickly dismissed it. She was a nobody, an interruption, an insignificant variable in his perfectly orchestrated day. He gestured impatiently, his voice dripping with the familiar, condescending authority she knew so well. "Yes, do you have a question?" he asked, the words a clear dismissal. Elena leaned forward, her lips almost touching the microphone, and her voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, filled every corner of the vast room. It was not the voice of a waitress. It was the voice of an advocate, calm, clear, and resonant, with an authority that seemed to come from a place far deeper than a single person. "Mr. Thorne," she began, the syllables precise and cutting. "My name is Elena Vance." The name hung in the air, meaningless to him, but the power with which she said it commanded the absolute, undivided attention of everyone present. "I don't have a question," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "I have a statement regarding the founding of Thorne Global Properties, and specifically, the fraudulent acquisition of the Vance real estate portfolio in Brooklyn 2 decades ago." A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. The name Vance, linked with the word fraud, had detonated the carefully managed atmosphere of the event. Thorne's professional smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, reptilian fury. He knew that name. From the deepest, darkest archives of his memory, the name of the old man he had swindled, the first rung on the ladder of his ascent, had been violently exhumed. His press secretary was already whispering frantically into a headset, and 2 large, stone-faced security guards began to move purposefully down the aisle toward Elena. But she did not falter. Her voice remained steady as she began to detail the crime, laying out the facts with the dispassionate precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. She spoke of a shell corporation, of falsified debt assessments, of forged signatures on a contract designed to bankrupt an honest man named Arthur Vance. As the security guards reached her, their hands about to fall on her shoulders, Ben Carter, from his seat in the 3rd row, pressed a single key on his laptop. In that instant, the 3 massive screens behind Marcus Thorne flickered and died. The gleaming image of Thorne Tower vanished, plunging the stage into a momentary darkness before they roared back to life, not with architectural renderings, but with a single damning image from the past. A faded color photograph of a young, grinning Marcus Thorne shaking hands with her proud, unsuspecting grandfather. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The image, projected 20 feet high, was a ghost at the feast, an undeniable specter of Thorne's original sin appearing at the very moment of his greatest triumph. A wave of shock and confusion washed over the audience, followed by the frantic staccato explosion of 100 camera flashes. Thorne spun around, his face a grotesque canvas of pure, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed facade of the billionaire titan shattered, revealing the cheap, terrified fraud who had built an empire on a lie. He stammered into the microphone, his voice a pathetic, strangled squawk, ordering his technicians to cut the feed, but it was too late. Ben was in control. The photograph on the screens was replaced by a high-resolution scan of the sales contract itself, the thin, brittle paper, now a monumental testament to his crime. Then, one by one, her grandfather's desperate handwritten notes appeared, highlighted in a stark, blood-red circle. The word "forged" materialized next to a signature. Inflated appeared beside a column of figures. And finally, the heartbreaking plea, coercion. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters were on their feet, shouting questions, their professional decorum abandoned in the face of the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. Thorn stood frozen, a statue of hubris, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of his own exposed history, utterly and irrevocably destroyed. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. The fallout was a corporate apocalypse. Before the end of the day, the Securities and Exchange Commission had announced a formal investigation into Thorn Global Properties. By the time the market opened the next morning, its stock had entered a freefall from which it would never recover, its value evaporating into thin air. The powerful investors and city officials who had applauded him so enthusiastically just 24 hours earlier now tripped over themselves to publicly denounce him, severing all ties and desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive toxicity of his name. Marcus Thorn, the man who had moved markets and bent the city to his will, became a pariah overnight. His carefully crafted legacy was reduced to a single damning headline: the Thorn Fraud. The news cameras that had once documented his triumphs now feasted on his ruin, capturing his pathetic, shuffling figure as he was hounded by reporters on the steps of the federal courthouse, his face hidden behind a newspaper, a fallen king stripped of his crown, his kingdom, and his dignity. The story of Thorn Tower became a cautionary tale, a monument to greed that would never be built, its glossy renderings replaced by the grainy, haunting photograph of a handshake that had sealed two fates. But amidst the ashes of Thorn's empire, a different story was taking root. Several weeks later, a news crew stood outside the old brick apartment building in Brooklyn, the very building that had been the catalyst for it all. They were interviewing the new owner, the CEO of a rival development firm that had acquired Thorn's defaulted assets in a fire sale. The CEO, a sharp, empathetic woman named Sarah Jennings, announced that her company's first order of business was to formally and permanently cancel all pending eviction proceedings against the building's long-term residents. She spoke of community, of corporate responsibility, and of honoring the legacy of the building's original owner, a man named Arthur Vance. She then looked directly into the camera and made a promise, guaranteeing lifetime tenancy for his widow, Grace Vance, ensuring that the last fragile link to that legacy would be protected forever. In her small, sunlit apartment, Grace watched the broadcast, tears of disbelief and relief streaming down her face. The war was over, her home was safe, her family's honor after so many years had finally been restored. The world had been made right again, not by an army, but by the courage and brilliance of her granddaughter. Months later, Elena Vance walked through a set of gleaming glass doors, not as a servant, but as a peer. She was dressed in a simple, elegant suit, an armor of her own choosing, as she entered the executive offices of Sarah Jennings' firm. The meeting was short, not an interview, but a confirmation. Jennings, who had been profoundly moved and impressed by Elena's story, had seen not just a victim seeking justice, but a brilliant legal mind with an unbreakable moral compass. She didn't just offer Elena a job, she offered her a mission. A new division was being created within the company, a pro bono and community affairs department, and they wanted Elena to build it from the ground up, to lead it, to be its soul. She was being given a platform, a budget, and the full backing of the company to use her formidable legal skills as a shield for the vulnerable, to fight for the families that predators like Marcus Thorn saw only as, quote, dead weight. It was the career she had been destined for, a path she had been forced to abandon, now returned to her, more meaningful and more powerful than she could ever have imagined. She accepted, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound sense of purpose. The final scene is one of peace, a quiet resolution after a long and brutal war. Elena stands with her grandmother, Grace, in the living room of the apartment that is now, and will forever be, their home. The room is filled with the warm light of a late afternoon sun. Through the window, the sounds of the Brooklyn neighborhood, the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the community she saved, drift up from the street below. There are no more threatening letters, no more sleepless nights, no more fear. There is only the quiet comfort of family and the deep, unshakable knowledge that justice, though it may travel a long and difficult road, can and will prevail. Elena has not just reclaimed her family's honor. She has forged a new legacy, one built not on brick and mortar, but on courage, intelligence, and a righteous fire that refused to be extinguished. She transformed her greatest pain into her greatest power, and in doing so, she reminded the world that a person's worth is never defined by their uniform or their station, but by the unyielding strength they hold within their heart. Her journey from the shadows was complete, a testament to the fact that the most powerful voice can often come from the one person nobody ever bothered to listen to. If Elena Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.